Okay, good evening to everyone, and welcome to the FJMC Keynote Series of webinars. My name is Norwin Marins, and along with Bruce Fagan, we're pleased to be on board tonight for the presentation on the challenging subject of interfaith marriages in the Jewish religion, and all of the associated questions that go with it. Our speaker this evening is Rabbi Ari Saks, who recently completed an 11-year career as a full-time pulpit rabbi with stops at Beth Mordechai in Perth, Amboy from 2012 to 2017, and the Huntington Jewish Center on Long Island, 2017 to 2023. During these years, he served as president of the Rabbinical Association in the heart of New Jersey and as a deputy commander of the Perth Amboy Police Chaplain Corps. Rabbi Saks's focus tonight is going to be on reaching out to interfaith families, primarily through his recently launched podcast, Interfaithing: Why Families Can Embrace Two Faiths Under One Roof. The podcast can be found on all podcast platforms. Rabbi Saks is also developing unique online education curricula, including Torah teachings for Jewish grandparents of interfaith families and how Israel should be taught on college campuses. The first portion of the presentation will focus on the halakha aspects, and Rabbi Saks has indicated that he will entertain questions at the end associated with any ritual questions that anyone on board this evening would like to ask. So with that, I'd like to present Rabbi Ari Saks.
Thank you, Norwin. Thank you, Bruce. It is such a pleasure to be able to join Federation of Jewish Men's Club events, this wonderful event. I would say that one of my earliest memories of a men's club event was when my father was the rabbi at Congregation Tiferet Israel in Lower Bucks County, and I really wanted to watch the Eagles play a Monday night game against the Cowboys, and he said, "Sure, you can come join because the men's club is hosting it. You just can't drink the beer." So now I could drink the beer, and I will say that the Eagles unfortunately lost that game. So it was sad, but it was a wonderful, wonderful time, and really just a joy to be able to be here and to speak with you today. And I hope that the learning that I have to offer today will be one for benefit of all, and honestly, for the benefit of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And as such, I would like to offer a bracha as we begin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So I had the pleasure of speaking at the biennial convention as part of a wonderful group, triumvirate of folks to talk about intermarriage. And in fact, one of them who is here, Dr. Karen McGinnity of USCJ, was on that panel, and it was a pleasure to share that panel. And I remember as we were going through the topic of the day of interfaith marriage and how we wanted to present it, we each had about 10 minutes or so. And when we got together, we said, well, you know what? Each one of us could probably have a 30 to 40-minute talk about the way in which we wanted to address the topic, but that place was not for it. Well, this is the place for that. So you're going to be getting a little bit more of an extended version of one of the main things I wanted to talk about during that session, if you were there at the biennial. And yet it's also going to be very different, because what I'm going to be doing right now is going deeper into the halakha that I believe is possible for us to come to as a movement in order to fully embrace intermarriage. And that is halakha that says that not only is intermarriage okay, but that we can find Jewish halakhic language to say that it is okay. And I'm going to kind of explain at the beginning why I think that that's so important. But I'm not going to be spending so much time necessarily on the why am I even addressing this question, because the assumption that I'm coming in with it is that it's important. The next step, and one of the things that differentiates us from, let's say, other movements out there, is the question, okay, so how are we going to do that? How are we going to say that intermarriage is okay for us to embrace as a movement? And I'll also say, I also recognize that being here as part of the men's club, who has done such amazing work within our movement and really was the first organization to do that Kiruv outreach efforts. And so standing upon the shoulder of giants who said that we want to embrace interfaith families, intermarried families. And this is to say that there is a halachic pathway to be able to do that. So just very briefly in thinking about why that halachic pathway is important, and I'm going to be sharing my screen so you'll be able to see. I'm not going to be spending so much time necessarily on this part of the topic, which is the approach to halakha, because at the biennial, I focused a little bit more on what role does halakha play in this conversation. The approach to halakha I want to offer here comes out of 3 different teachings, 2 of them from chancellors of the Jewish Theological Seminary, whose building was pictured in the first slide that you may have seen. From Chancellor Ismar Shorsh in Polarities and Balance, and hence the way I phrased the topic, overall, I think it is fair to describe conservatism as seeking to offer a maximum amount of traditional Judaism to the largest number of modern Jews. A maximum amount of traditional Judaism to the largest number of modern Jews. I've always found that statement to be very moving. And what I would offer is that the finding halakha to accept interfaith marriage is to continue that process, to continue to offer traditional Judaism in conservative shuls to the largest number of modern Jews, which has to include a great number of Jewish individuals and Jewish families and interfaith families who have members of different faith traditions in their homes. So this is following along the line of what Chancellor Shorsh was speaking about. But not only that, what Chancellor Gershon Cohen said back in, this was in 1966, he gave a commencement address at Hebrew Teachers College in Boston, and this was a part of a collection of his writings called Jewish History and Jewish Destiny, speaks to how this process of offering a maximum amount of traditional Judaism for the largest number of Jews from that time period, the time period in which the rabbis were living, and that they're speaking to the people in their time and not focusing on a time that they're not living in, that this has always been the job of rabbis. He says, Philo was a responsible teacher. He acted according to the dictum of the rabbis, Dibra Torah bahoveh, Dibru hachachamim bahoveh. That is, scripture or Torah spoke in the language of its world, and the rabbis spoke in the language of their world. And I think that what else is there is that the job of the rabbis is to connect the scripture that spoke in the language of its world, and we're supposed to help interpret that for our world today and to make that language cohesive. And then the final piece, and this comes from a much earlier source, although the authors are modern Israeli authors from Hebrew University who wrote a fabulous book on the topic of idolatry, which you're going to hear that topic come up a lot tonight. The medieval rabbinic authorities, especially the Tosafists, considered the Jewish community a holy community and therefore considered it their task to justify the acts of the community as being in accordance with the halakha. In other words, if rabbis care about the people in their community, they're going to search for the ways in which we can justify the actions of its community as holy, as part of Torah. That's what this is about. That's the job of halakha in every instance, in every age. And I'm so excited about this opportunity to share some of that work that I've collected and I've done over the past 11, 12, 13 years, even since I was in the middle of rabbinical school, and found this calling to serve the needs and to welcome interfaith families into the Jewish community, to be able to share some of that with you in what I hope could be an actual tshuva, allowing the conservative movement to embrace interfaith families completely and wholly into our movement. So what I want to work on with you today is part of what I like to call the 5-step halachic process as it refers to this particular issue of intermarriage. Now, I also have a bit of a Torah mnemonic because I think it nicely fits and it's kind of fun. So if you can't have fun doing something, then why do it? So the mnemonic takes the idea of 5 steps and attributes it to the 5 books of Torah: Bereshit, Genesis, Shemot, Exodus, Vayikra, Leviticus, Bamidbar, Numbers, Devarim, Deuteronomy. So the first step is the Bereshit step. And in any good shuva, as we were taught in rabbinical school, if you're going to write something, you have to be able to share the history. You have to be able to explain what have rabbis said over the course of history on this particular topic. Because if you can't explain it, or if you don't know it, then how can we take you seriously as speaking as an authentic voice within the Jewish community? So the 5-step halakhic process, the first step, the Breshit step, is to understand the origin of this question. And then what we learn if we look at the history of intermarriage is that the majority of Jewish literature says intermarriage is prohibited. I want to be very clear. The majority of Jewish literature says it is prohibited. So if you view halakha as simply being a numbers game, how many sources prove my one point over the other? And if it's 20 sources that says, oh, it's not okay, and 2 sources that say it is okay, well, then of course it's not going to work. And we know that because this would not be a challenging issue if the sources were a little bit more even. So any understanding of how to move forward has to start from that premise. But what I would argue is that the job of halakha is not to be a numbers game. In fact, the job of halakha is to understand what is the core argument behind that larger point, which that point may still be there, but to also see if there's another teaching that can be used as a way of saying, maybe there's a new way of understanding this today, and not to take away from the way that it has been thought, and to say that that is still true, but to say that we are going to choose to apply this methodology to our situation today because our situation calls for it, and because the voice that we are expressing is authentic and true as well, since that voice also comes from the heart of tradition. Because what I think you're going to take away from going through that majority of Jewish literature that says that intermarriage is prohibited is that the prohibition against intermarriage is intimately connected with the prohibition against idolatry. Everything about intermarriage is related to do not bow down, do not believe in idols, do not believe in the way that other nations pray and think about God. That's the core argument, which means that an authentic way, halachically, to be able to show that intermarriage is allowed is to say this. Whoops. Is to say something else, actually, it's about to come shortly in terms of, I just kind of blew my thunder. I just lost it there for a second, but that's okay. I decided to redo my organization here. So what I wanted to do actually right now is to explain a little bit of that history of intermarriage so that you can understand what I'm talking about. So there are plenty of biblical sources and rabbinic sources on the topic of intermarriage that proves that it is prohibited. Just to give you a couple of those examples that we get from biblical and rabbinic text. Abraham tells his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac in the land of his birth, but not from the daughters of the Canaanites, because he didn't want to have a Canaanite. Rebekah was bitter that her son Esau took a wife from the Hittite clan, and he thus convinced Isaac to instruct Jacob to go to his mother's family to find a wife and not take a wife from among the Canaanites. And then even Esau, who had already taken one wife from a local clan, decided to take his next wife from the family of Ishmael as opposed to a wife from the local Canaanites, meaning to keep it more within the context of the family. When it comes to the prophets, Hosea says that if you marry somebody of a different faith tradition, God will abandon you because you're going to have alien children to come from them. Speaking about a verse on the book of Joshua, the commentator Abarbanel says that you should not put love of others before love of God. And by the way, interesting to note that many of the examples of intermarriage earlier in the Bible, specifically Moses as one of them, it was shown by the rabbis, or at least in their interpretations, that those women actually converted to Judaism, and therefore it's not an example of intermarriage. Philo, who is a more ancient source, not necessarily rabbinic, a little proto-rabbinic, he says that if you follow in the path of God, that is a pious path, but to go among all the other nations, that is the pathless wild. That is not a direction you want to go in. And then in thinking about the codes of Jewish law, you have that Maimonides says, and is backed up also by Rabbi Joseph Carr in the Shulchan Aruch, that the prohibition against intermarriage is not just for the nations in Israel, which we're going to get to that in a moment, but it's prohibition against all nations. And specifically, the prohibition is not about sex with people who are not Jewish. It's about marriage. It's about an exclusive relationship with folks, and that is what is prohibited. And then you have examples in the Talmud where a non-Jew cannot enact kiddushin, which is an issue for weddings. That if a Jew marries somebody who's not Jewish, that there's no actual wedding that happens between them. Hillel and Shammai also have the point that you should not drink with people who are not Jewish because it could lead you to what happens after you drink wine. And that all of these things are because the influence of people from a different faith tradition, a different culture, is going to lead you astray. And that is because, or I should say, that the reason behind all of this language related to do not marry somebody of a different tradition is because there is a direct link in Torah and in, I should say, in the book of Deuteronomy and in the book of Ezra, in the latter part of the Bible, linking the prohibition against intermarriage with the prohibition against idolatry. As it says in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3-5, you shall not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from me to worship other gods. You can see it right there with 3 and 4. Those two verses, do not intermarry, for they will lead you astray because they are going to worship other gods. And then in Ezra, something similar. Shall we once again violate your commandments by intermarrying with these people who follow such abhorrent practices? We're going to see soon that one of the ways in which idolatry is understood has to do with immoral actions, that these are things that not good people don't do. You don't do idolatry. You follow God. You follow God's law. And so how could you marry somebody who comes from that other side of the track? That's not an okay thing to do. They're going to lead you astray. It's going to take you away from the true way of doing things. So it is clear that the majority of our literature says that intermarriage is prohibited. But as we just saw with those two texts, those keystone texts, I'm not just saying keystone because I'm in the best state in the country, in Pennsylvania, go Philly, is that the point of intermarriage is to keep you away from doing idolatry, which leads to the question, what is idolatry? Because if we want to make a halakhic argument that would allow for intermarriage within our movement, we have to show that what Torah and in many cases the rabbis thought of as idolatry is not the same thing as it is today, and that people who would be considered idolaters in the times of the Torah or in the times of the rabbis are not the same kind of people today. That Gentiles are not idolaters. And the amazing thing about our tradition is that is what we find. By focusing on idolatry and understanding the way that idolatry is used both in the context of Tanakh, we understand that idolatry can be defined in myriad of ways, and that it also teaches that for rabbis in their generation, just like it should be in our generation, that today's Gentiles are not considered to be idolaters. So here we go. We're going to be looking at the first three different texts that we're going to look at. One from the prophet Malachi, the second from the book of Leviticus, and then this is one of my favorite texts from Talmud in Masechet Megillah. Helps us understand three different ways of looking at who an idolater is. An idolater is one, follower of a foreign god. Makes sense. Number two, idolater is an immoral person. It has nothing to do with their worship. It has to do with their character. And the third, and this is one of my favorites, is that how do you define a Jew as someone who is not an idolater? Which means that somebody who is not an idolater could also be described as a Jew. I want you to hold that thought because that's going to be very important for thinking about how we can make an argument, how we can make a shift to say that intermarriage is acceptable. So we're going to take a look at those three. So focusing on idolatry, idolaters are defined in a myriad of ways. Here's the verse from Malachi. Verse 11, Judah has broken faith. Abhorrent things have been done in Israel and Jerusalem. For Judah has profaned what is holy to and desired by God and espoused daughters of alien gods. In the Hebrew, bat el nechar. Now, by the way, that phrase, uva'al bat el nechar, means like they actually married or espoused this daughters of alien gods, may be a way to specifically say it's not alien gods per se, it's a woman from an alien tradition. Thus, it may be talking directly about intermarriage. So that intermarriage and idolatry are inherently connected simply because you, as someone of a different faith, are belonging to or related directly in the context of your family and your tradition and your tribe to this other god. Therefore, if you take a woman as a wife from this other family, from this other faith tradition, then you are going to be following that foreign god, or at least bringing that foreign god into your own home. Okay? So that's one way of being an idolater. Here's a really interesting one. It comes from Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21. Do not allow any of your offspring to be offered up to Molech, and do not profane the name of your God. I am Hashem. Now, this verse does not actually have anything to do with intermarriage per se. It all has to do with this act of idolatry. But what is interesting, and this is brought up by Shia J.D. Cohen in his great book on the beginnings of Jewishness, on different varieties and borders and boundaries, really terrific book. He said that this verse was actually used for a while in being the rabbinic explanation as to why you should not marry someone else from a different faith tradition. In other words, this is the verse that proved to them that you should not intermarry, because what's important about this verse is these are people, idolaters are people who sacrifice their children. The whole story of Abraham almost sacrificing his son is not just the fact that God asked him to do it and he didn't do it and God stopped him. It's that it was trying to prove that this was an immoral act. This was not something that was okay. And we know that when it comes to this verse, because this verse appears in a list of other prohibitions that at that time of Torah that were considered to be immoral, something that was not okay for anyone to do. And so therefore, being an idolater was not just that you bow down to the wrong God. It's that you did terrible things. You did wrong things as a person. This is one of my favorites. This is in Masechet Megillah. Rabbi Yochanan said a different explanation of the verse. There's a verse it's talking about in the in Megillat Esther, talking about Mordechai, when Mordechai is introduced as Mordechai, Ish Yehudi ben Kish Ish Yemini, that particular verse in the scroll of Esther, that in that verse, Mordechai came from the tribe of Benjamin. Ish Yemini, according to most translations, Yemini means the Benjamite tribe. Well, how then is it possible that he was also called Yehudi? Because if you take a look at that verse, it says Mordechai Ish Yehudi. So the reason is that according to this tradition, he can be both a Benjamite and a Yehudi, which we think would mean he comes from the tribe of Judea. It's not just that matter that he's a Jew, because that may not necessarily be the case at this point in time, that Jew may not have been used, but rather it's because he repudiated idol worship. Because remember that the time we get introduced to Mordechai, although not at that point, a little bit later on, is that he doesn't bow down to Haman. So it seems that Ish Yehudi is actually describing the fact that he did not bow down to idols. He was not an idolater. Therefore, on account of the fact that he repudiated idol worship, for anyone who repudiates idolatry is called Yehudi. In the Hebrew, Al Shum Shekafar Ba'avodah Zara Shekol hakofer b'avodah zara nikra Yehudi. It's an amazing teaching, right? That somebody who doesn't do this act of idolatry, whatever it is, if it's immoral or if it's an actual belief, if you don't do that, then you're considered to actually be a Jew or like a Jew, that's a part of who we are. And so regardless necessarily of what the actual definition of idolatry is, as long as you're not that, then you're either a Jew or someone who is like a Jew. So I hope you can kind of see where this is going. And that is to make the case that Gentiles are not idolaters because they just follow the customs of their ancestors. A teaching from Hulin 13b. Now, you might notice that I have a Christmas tree up there. One of the biggest questions for a very long time is, can an interfaith family have a Christmas tree? Well, many interfaith families have said to me and to others that we don't necessarily have it because of our faith. We have it because it's part of our culture, what we grew up with, and is a nice event. We want to be able to share with our family. And this text from Masechet Hulin speaks about the nature of the idea that culture is something that we want to pass along, but it doesn't have to include all of the theological ideas that may be problematic to a person being able to relate to a person of a different cultural tradition. Here's what the Gemara Hulin says. The Gemara notes, Rabba bar Avu holds in accordance with that which Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says. The status of Gentiles outside of Eretz Yisrael is not that of idol worshippers, as their worship is not motivated by faith and devotion. Rather, it is a traditional custom of their ancestors that was transmitted to them. Or in the Hebrew, Ela minhag avotehen biyadehen. On one note, I would say actually that to some degree, I think many Jews follow that concept that we're Jews not because of our theological beliefs, but because of our culture. We're passing along the traditions of our ancestors, or that's are transmitted to us. So I want to think about that in a very positive sense of wanting to transmit our culture and our tradition. The second thing, though, just want to make a mark of, we're not going to spend so much time on it because it's a little bit technical, is he's talking about the idea that idol worshipers are people who are not in the land of Eretz Yisrael. Well, if you remember, I mentioned before that verse in Leviticus was for a while the verse that rabbis used to promote the prohibition against intermarriage. It's because that the original prohibition against intermarriage, the one from Deuteronomy that we looked at earlier, is one that seemingly is only referring to certain nations, that certain nations are considered to be idolaters, but other nations are not. I mentioned a little bit earlier that Maimonides actually says that there's no separation among different groups. It's all idolaters or it's all not idolaters per se. So that's why it's saying specifically in terms of outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. But I would also argue that what they're talking about here in terms of outside Eretz Yisrael is that Eretz Yisrael, and we can think about this in terms of everything happening right now, is a land that brings up a lot of emotion for people. It's a land that is considered to be so holy that you have people from different faith backgrounds who have fought over that land for centuries. When you're outside the land, maybe that feeling of it doesn't affect me in the same way. Maybe there's a little more freedom to be able to see another person as just a person who has customs, who has traditions that are important to them, just like we want them to see of ourselves. Okay. Rabbeinu Gershom Meir HaGolah takes this teaching from Hulin, and he offers a teaching on it that's going to launch into the last section of really learning that we're going to do for today. And what's important here is to know this. First, Rabbeinu Gershom Meir HaGolah, he was the rabbi who came up with the takana, with the ruling that a Jewish man is not allowed to take more than one wife. There's no place in Torah where that's from. There's no place anywhere else in tradition where that's allowed. But he says this must be a change. So he is a rabbi who is willing to say, I need to make a change for my generation because this is an important change to make. He was not afraid of saying something that may have gone against the grain from others who may have looked down upon them, but rather he said something that was important for the continued success of his generation. Okay? This is what he says. He uses that teaching from Chulin and says, we can rely upon Rabbi Yochanan, who said, nations outside the land of Israel are not idolaters, they are permitted, which I think is more to say. We can rely upon Rabbi Yochanan in that there are nations, there are people who just follow the customs of their ancestors. Thus, commerce with them on their holiday is allowed. Now, this is a very important point because when it comes to the actual matters on the ground of what idolatry looks like or what it means to not engage with idolaters, in Masechet Avodah Zarah, which is the section of Talmud focusing on all matters related to idolatry, we have tons and tons of text about ways in which Jews should not interact with non-Jews, with these quote-unquote idolaters. And at the core of that idea is commerce. Do not engage in business with these folks, especially on their holidays. Why? Because if you engage in business with them on their holidays, then they're going to bring a gift from the commerce that you had with them as a gift to their gods, which makes a lot of sense. But it's this idea of having commerce with these individuals. Not talking about marriage at all. We're talking about just commerce, talking about business relationships. That was the reason why Rabbeinu Gershom Meor HaGolah had to make a significant shift in the way in which Jews of his time outside the land of Israel interacted with the people of with non-Jews, with other nations that they were living with. And that is, there were lots of members of his community who were doing business with their friends, with their colleagues of different traditions, and they had to do business on their holidays. And is there anything that wrong with it? And remember the teaching I offered from the Israeli scholars that they brought about the medieval period, about the Tosafists. It's that the Tosafist rabbis weren't saying like, "Oy, there they go again, coming up with something they want me to have a ruling on that's going to make things lenient." No, they're saying this is a holy community and my job is to find a way to say that this action is holy. And I'm going to do so by looking at the way in which I can bring my tradition to bear and to show that this is a valid and authentic way of understanding our tradition, that you can engage in commerce with non-Jews, even on their holidays, which can only be if the people he's engaging with, he does not consider to be idolaters at all. And that gets into the final point I want to really focus on, which is that Gentiles today are not idolaters. And for this, I'm going to bring in a teaching from Rabbi Menachem HaMeiri, who was a great 13th century scholar from France, 14th century scholar from France, who kind of reflects on the different ways in which I mentioned earlier that idolatry is understood. And this comes from his treatise called Beit HaBechira, in which he is a commentary on all of Talmud, and particularly this section on his commentary on Masechet Avodah Zarah, which I referenced before. So the first point is to show that they're not followers of foreign gods. If idolatry is the worship of foreign gods and idolaters are people who worship foreign gods, then I must show that the individuals in my time are not actually followers of those foreign gods. That's the argument. So here's what he says. All that is mentioned here in Masechet Avodah Zarah is in regards to those who worship false gods and their statues and their images. But in our day, it is fully permissible to engage in business transactions with non-Jews, right? Bismanim halelu mutar legamre. Legamre. There's no room for doubt. These are not idolaters. You can absolutely do business with them. There's no issue. The text that we have, it has to do with people who were a long time ago. This is not anyone that we have to be worried about. So these are not idolaters because they're not worshiping other gods. All right. They're not immoral people, right? If idolaters are people who do really bad things, that they're immoral, how can we prove that these folks are actually moral and good? And thus it is also said in the Tosefta regarding the mitzvah, do not give them quarter, do not give them free gifts to use for idolatry. What are these matters regarding? A non-Jew who you don't know or who goes about from place to place. However, one who is loved or is a neighbor, it is permissible to sell to that person since that person is known. If you can see in the Hebrew, the middle of the second line, it says, Aval haya ohavo o shcheno mutar, she'eno ela kemochrolo. That this is somebody that you get, you see, you know, you appreciate. You've had conversations with them. You've talked about how the Eagles are going to win the Super Bowl in the same year that the Phillies are going to win the World Series. Sorry to all you New York fans out there. But the point is that these are good people because you've gotten to know them. And how many of us are sitting in this space because we've met people in our families and in our communities who, the moment we've gotten to know them, we're like, you're a good person. And the fact that you are not Jewish doesn't change the fact that you're a good person. And that is so important for understanding the fact that today's Gentiles are not idolaters. The final one. This is based off of the piece from about Mordechai in Masechet Megillah. The notion that if you are not an idolater, it means you're a Jew. Or maybe I like to put it that you're as trustworthy as a Jew. You're as trustworthy as I would be to somebody of my own clan, my own people. But the essence of the matter is, as we wrote, that even in those times, no person was careful about these issues at all. Even on the day of the festivals of idol worshippers, no Gaon, no rabbi, no chacham, no student, no chassid, nor one is becoming a chassid. No one cared about doing commerce with non-Jews on the days of their holidays. And so they're looking to their leaders. People are looking to the leaders to say, are these people okay? And they're saying, yeah, we trust them, so you should trust them. And if a leader says to trust them, it's like the leader is saying that they're just as good as a Jew, which I know that language may be a little bit, let's just say, that's a different conversation about that kind of language. But it's important here is to say that if being a Jew was shorthand for being somebody that you could trust, well, the leaders are saying, even though these people may not identify as Jews, they are just as trustworthy as Jews. And thus, they are not idolaters. They're not followers of foreign gods. They're not immoral people. And they're just as trustworthy as fellow Jews. And I would argue, overall, that the question around how we can find a halakhic way to accept intermarriage is by leaning into this idea that Gentiles are not idolaters, that idolatry was the reason why we should not engage in intermarriage. That reason may still apply in certain circumstances, and we can have that conversation, but into the idea of legamre, like this is not our case. We're not talking about that here, and that our tradition gives us language to be able to use. So yeah, if we just want to know what our tradition says and look at the number of sources, of course, there's no argument. But if we want to find a reason because we see our community as holy, as a fellow rabbi said to me, that's when you need somebody who understands the sources, who's willing to do the work to be able to find the way, find the reasoning that can make it work for that community so that we can show that our community is just as holy as every other Jewish community. Now, I know I said a lot. That was actually only part two. Part one was like the Breshit part, the origin, the history of it all. This was the, I didn't really say it, but this was the Shemot part, because Shemot is dealing all with Egypt, and Egypt was the home of a different religion. So this is dealing with all that issue. There are three other parts of that would make up this tshuva, which I'd be happy to talk about a little bit, but that's not the focus of tonight's session. If you would like to have me back and to talk more about it, be happy to share with you how I think this idea of accepting that Gentiles are not idolaters, what the next step is, or what the concerns might still be, and how those can be addressed. Because there are a lot of different steps that we need to take on a major issue like this, but the main point I want to get across is that it is there. It is there if we want to engage with it, and if we are willing to take that necessary step for our community.
Okay, Rabbi, you've certainly given us a lot to think about and consider. While you were speaking, there were a few questions that came in the
Sure.
Q&A. One is the follower of a faith tradition that calls for immoral actions such as the elimination of Jews not an idolater?
So I would say that if we take a look at every faith tradition out there, including our own, we have very, very nasty things to say about other faith traditions. The key question is not if the faith tradition as a whole, but does the individual themselves who may be getting married, do they hold it? One of my favorite stories about this is a Baptist woman who was getting married to a Jewish guy. This was when I was in New Jersey, and I did not do the wedding, but they came to me to talk about, what was going on, and I had some sessions with them because from the very beginning, I had embraced the idea of having two faiths within the context of one home, which was what they were interested in. And she said, "Yeah, growing up, I only knew the only thing I thought of as a Jew is that they had horns." Like that was their history. Now we could say on one hand, "Oh yeah, I can't believe that you're saying that we can marry somebody like that." And actually I'm saying is, "Oh my God, isn't that an amazing thing? That here is somebody who had that faith, who had that particular understanding of what a Jew is, and now that idea is being changed." I just recently at my congregation in Rhode Island had dinner with a couple of families who in different ways are part of this question of interfaith and intermarriage. And in the conversation I had with them, what also seemed to come up were the ways in which the non-Jewish grandparents understood the concerns related to the Jewish identity of their grandchildren, and how that is going to lead to conversation about, do you realize you have Jewish grandchildren now? And what does that mean? A way to do the work of maybe I'll use it in a certain kind of a way to do tikkun olam, to really make the world better, is not by running away from the reality that's out there, but to embrace the reality and see the opportunities that it has to be able to share Jewish wisdom and Jewish experience, especially with folks who may never get another chance to, unless it's because one of their loved ones falls in love with a Jew.
Okay, what is the U.S. JC stance on intermarriage, or does the stance sit with each individual rabbi?
So I am not standing here representing any particular institution of the conservative movement. So I don't want to speak directly to the policies of the movement overall. What I know of the policies of the movement is that no change has been made in any official capacity other than to say, we know we need to do more kiruv. What that looks like on the ground, whether or not there is a willingness to look at the deeper halakhic implications of accepting intermarriage wholeheartedly by embracing intermarried families, that's, I think, to be determined overall. But what I can say is, and what I'm hoping with, especially with an event like this, is that we can really begin the conversation in a public setting about not only what some of these issues are, but really of the key items that need to be discussed. And from a rabbinic standpoint, text is the way to do it. We have a lot of conversations that get people heated, and when it comes to their emotions and their own stories, and there's a place for stories. But one of the things I absolutely love about being Jewish is just how text can help us engage in meaningful conversations, whether it's pastorally, whether that's morally, whether that's whatever the topic may be, that texts are our way in to be able to have conversations that allow us to be able to talk deeply and with respect as Jews. And I hope that we'll be able to have more opportunities to be able to do that together.
Okay, thank you. Are there idolaters today that would still be prohibited? What about Hindus?
Hindus, I think, are fascinating question. And let's just say I'm looking forward to the first opportunity I have to really engage with a Hindu Jewish couple to really talk about it. Here's my big kitzur, my shorthanded version. In the little that I know, of the pantheon of Hindu gods, the gods do not exist as independent entities. And for instance, the head god Brahma can take the form of a variety of different gods and yet still be Brahma, or still be one, but also the other. Or maybe it's that there's a combination. That is to say that it's not that it's about having different individuals or different entities. It's about the idea that there is a connection to the oneness of God. One of my favorite teachings in our tradition is that we are not allowed to study Kabbalah or study Jewish mysticism until we're 40 years old. Why? Not because it will drive us crazy or because it's too esoteric, but because it will undermine many of our core beliefs, including the idea that there's only one God. If you take a look at the 10 sefirot of the Kabbalistic body, or all the way in which the Kabbalah is sort of has these different categories of ahava, of yirah, of chokhmah, binah, all these different things, you would say, oh my God, they're like different gods. They're like different deities. And they're not that far off. It's just the Jewish way of doing the work of trying to understand what God's all about. And that's the core idea. If I were to say there's any kind of idolatry it's out there, it's a knowledge. It's saying that I know exactly what the truth is. I think the ultimate idea of oneness is the humility to understand that we don't fully know, and that we're willing to accept the nuance of life and the nuance of different traditions and have different ways of understanding what God wants of us, and to be able to be more willing to embrace that ambiguity, as opposed to saying, well, you have so many different gods, and so therefore you're just not good for me.
All right, here's another interesting question. If a non-Jewish lady marries a Jewish man and they want to raise children, do the children still need to be converted?
Okay. In a tshuva that I would want to write, which what I shared with you is some of the basics of what would be included in that, I want to start it by saying that a tshuva on intermarriage is relatively toothless without a sister tshuva accepting patrilineal descent as another form of acceptable Jewish inheritance. Now, the way in which to do that halachically is different than the intermarriage tshuva. It's not about idolatry when it comes to patrilineal. In fact, what's very clear is that there was a period of time in which Jews were patrilineal, and there was a period of time and there was a moment in which that changed. So the conversation about a non-Jewish woman and a Jewish man and having children, I think that we also need to engage in the question about patrilineal descent. And just like if we are saying, especially when it comes to Kiruv, especially when it comes to welcoming interfaith families, because I've had this situation occur in my shuls where families leave, not because they couldn't theoretically convert the children, but because they felt less than. That they're in a community where they're very involved, where the non-Jewish woman is sitting on the board of trustees, that the Jewish man is involved in the educational direction of the congregation, but another family who do absolutely nothing, but the woman happens to be Jewish, oh, we can give their kid a bar mitzvah, but we can't give the other kid one, unless they go through a conversion, which we're only asking of them. So this is a very important question to be asking. I do believe it's necessary, and I do believe that there is a pathway to do that. You want to have me back on? I'm happy to share what that pathway might be.
Okay, a couple more ritual specific questions. How do you handle a brit milah when the mother isn't Jewish, but the baby will be raised as a Jew?
So at this point in time, you can do a brit milah l'shem gerut, in which the purpose is for conversion, that the child could be going to the mikvah afterwards. So that is an issue where I should say that there are many cases in which that is the case. The question becomes if the family is wanting to go through with the possibility of the mikvah. Now, again, that's in our current situation. Again, I think that would also have to be addressed with the idea of patrilineal descent.
All right, thank you. In some synagogues, non-Jewish spouses are not allowed to participate on the bima for a bar bat mitzvah. Getting an aliyah with a spouse addressing the bar bat mitzvah on the bima. How can the USCJ help in making a uniform statement for USCJ synagogues to follow?
So here's what I understand about what is happening right now. As part of the USCJ and RA's process of investigating what are the rules on the books regarding intermarried families, this is one of the issues that is there. I will say that currently on the books are tshuvot or policies that were written in the late 1980s and early 1990s with a little bit of an adaptation in the 2000s, none of which really do justice to what current practice is in most congregations. I know that that is something that is being worked on. I don't know anything more about the process of what that looks like since I'm not involved in any of those conversations. And yet I think it's very critical. At the same time, you know what? Ask the ritual committee.
There was a question about your congregation that you visit or are part of in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Could you give a little detail on that?
Sure. So part of my decision and because of circumstance to change how my family and I went about our life as a family, as professionals, is that I left the full-time rabbinic work to decide. We decided as a family to choose the place that we want to live. Because as a rabbi, if you're a rabbi of a congregation, unfortunately, you don't really get that choice. You can stay in, as long as you have a job, that's great. But if you, for whatever reason, lose a job, you probably also have to change homes. You have to change cities. And that does a lot to your family. So we decided to choose a home. And our home, which you might have heard a little bit over the course of the presentation, is in Philadelphia. So we decided to move to Philadelphia. And that meant trying to figure out how the jobs or how professional life would fit in. And as such, I love pulpit work. And at the same time, I also know that it's not going to satisfy all the needs that I have as a rabbi at this point in my career. So I go there about 1 to 2 times a month, take Amtrak up on a Friday, am there for a weekend, and then come back on a Sunday. And it's been great. When I'm there, I am there. And when I'm not there, I'm not there. It's been a wonderful relationship with the congregation, mostly there for simchas and for other events with families and for the congregation. And we're looking forward to another wonderful year upcoming. And it's just a great relationship because I provide a need for the congregation and it allows me to be able to spend time when I'm not at the congregation to do work like this with a podcast that has grown. We have over 2,000 downloads at this point in time, which is very good for where we are in our current stage. 1 season that we've already completed, talking about the myths related to interfaith family living, working on projects related to interfaith families, because this has been a passion of mine really ever since I was in Israel for my 3rd year rabbinical school when I felt called to this work. And so it's a great privilege to be able to do this in this way at this time.
What is the name of the podcast and where is it available?
So first, I will say that the synagogue in Rhode Island is called Torah Israel in East Greenwich. If you're in Rhode Island, here's great for the summer. Please feel free to check us out. The podcast is called Interfaithing: Why Families Can Embrace 2 Faiths Under One Roof. And I do it together with a Christian colleague who was a co-teacher of mine at the interfaith community in New York. We were teaching there while I was in rabbinical school. It taught Jewish and Christian families. It taught their kids Judaism and Christianity together in the same room, so that sometimes it would be a Jewish lesson, but my Christian co-teacher would be there to kind of offer commentary. So it'll be a Christian lesson, and I'd be the Jewish teacher there to offer commentary. And it was so fascinating and so interesting that I think for those families who want to make it work in that way, there's a lot to be benefited, and also understand why some families really want to focus on having one faith in the home. And that's why in our podcast, we really say that there are many different ways to do interfaithing, to find ways to honor your faith traditions, whether that's fully in the home on an equal level, or whether that's when you're going to visit family, or in all the different ways, all different permutations. There's so many interesting ways to make both faith traditions and make both members of each family feel connected to one another.
Okay, we wanted to acknowledge the fact that Dr. Karen McGinnity is with us tonight, and she is the USCJ representative responsible for USCJ policies. Doctor, would you like to comment on any of the current USCJ policies on interfaith marriage?
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Saks, for the incredible teaching that you just shared with us. I certainly can speak to the policies. One clarification, I am not responsible for them. I am responsible for articulating them, clarifying them, and otherwise meeting with clergy and congregations to help everyone understand what they are and to think creatively about ways that communities can navigate forward in ways that are best for each community. That being said, tonight is really Ari's night, and I think we should focus on what we can learn from him, and I'm happy to schedule a time as soon as you would like to delve into policy and whatnot. But I think I just want to underscore Rabbi Saks's point about text being the way to do it, and just how thrilled I am that somebody is taking up Blue Greenberg's famous quote, where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halakhic way. So thank you, Rabbi Saks. It's a privilege to be able to call you my colleague.
And thank you to Dr. McGinnity. It is a pleasure to call you my colleague and work closely with her. And she's absolutely fabulous at what she does and has such passion for her work. So I want to give a great shout out to her. I would just also want to mention that I'm also happy to have conversations with anyone here and also with any of your communities as well. If this is a topic that you would like to have, whether it's a rabbi in residence or some other educational opportunity, I think that just continuing to teach without necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty of what exactly is going to happen, because everyone has sort of different, they have different things that they're balancing. But the most important thing, I think, as for everyone right now, is that we are the movement that believes in the value of learning Torah. And how much more important is it to learn Torah on any subject than the subject that is at the core of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world today? Over 70% of modern Jews marry somebody of a different faith tradition. Over 70%. That 70% does not have to be a number that scares us. It could be a number that enthuses us, but only if we are willing to take that leap and to discuss and to learn and to educate ourselves about how our tradition can be able to use this amazing opportunity to show that we are a holy community and we are a community that is worthy of God's presence and of continuation over the course of time.
Okay, we are just past 9 p.m. Central Time, and I wanted to acknowledge FJMC's Executive Director, Noam Raucher, who put us together with Rabbi Saks this evening, and we want to thank Rabbi Noam for his support and assistance with all of our webinar programming and future programs to come. If there are specific questions as we move along here, please let us know through the FJMC webinar series, and we would be pleased to take the questions and then route them to Rabbi Saks and keeping the conversation going. If there are other specific points that you would like to have Rabbi Saks or others touch on, do let us know, and we will certainly put that into the pipeline for future programming. So with that, I'd like to thank both Rabbi Saks and Rabbi Noam Raucher for their support this evening. And on behalf of FJMC, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.